So hello, welcome to Italy and welcome back to the channel, and more importantly, welcome to the first drive review of the all-new Ferrari Roma. Now, ever since I saw this car in pictures, I've been dying to see it in person. This is the first time, and as the case often is with Ferraris, the pictures don't do it justice. If you think it looks good on the photos, wait until you get a load of one in reality. Anyway, before we go for a drive, I think it's important as ever to give you a walk and talk of the features and upgrades of this car, because this really is the next generation of Ferrari. There's lots of tech, particularly on the inside, which is filtered down from SF90. So without further ado, let's take a walk and talk around the car and then importantly, immerse you in the drive. So here it is, the new Ferrari Roma. Now, first of all, we've got to talk about the aesthetic, and namely this new front grille, which is not typical of Ferrari design over recent years. There's a very different style of front grille, which was actually inspired by that of the 250 GT Lusso from the 60s. It's a much tighter design. The grille isn't quite as open, and oddly, in part, this is achievable thanks to the new 8-speed dual-clutch transmission gearbox. And you're probably wondering, how are these two things linked? Well, the new gearbox is not only lighter, but also runs a lot cooler, which has allowed Ferrari to play with the design of the front air intake. Because it doesn't require as much cooling, they've been able to make the openings a lot tighter and therefore give that nod to the grilles of the 60s. You'll notice that these headlights, they're much more akin to the headlights from the Monza SP1 and 2. Now, the eagle-eyed of you might have noticed that there's something missing from the side of the car. That's right, around about here, there would normally be the iconic Scooter rear shield. Now, the reason that that isn't on there is because the car is distinctly positioned as something entirely different in the Ferrari lineup. As simple as it is, just that move alone, not having a Scooter rear shield on the side of a new Ferrari, that's the first time it's ever happened, is a subtle nod to the fact that this is an entirely new proposition of a car. And in fact, it's so new that Ferrari believe that 70% of the clients which will ultimately end up buying these cars will be entirely new to the Ferrari brand. So that's how much of a change Ferrari thinks this car will be. Now, speaking of change, the familiar design language on the rear has also changed, namely the lights. Gone are the iconic round lights of the past decade. They've gone with a much sleeker, almost flat, slit-like design around the rear. This area here with the Ferrari badge, this whole black panel is in fact an active Aero rear wing. I shall demonstrate that to you when we go out for a drive shortly. You can't actually actuate it yourself. It does it automatically during the drive, but it does have 3 distinct Aero modes, which we will check out on the road shortly. And just while we are around the rear, let me just show you the boot. It is, after all, a Grand Tourer, so you might want to spend a road trip in it. You'll notice just how low the access is to the boot. This ultimately just makes it a lot easier to get bags in and out of. I've got one rucksack in there, but if I put it that way, you can see that you could quite easily fit 2 and go away for a decent road trip. Now, it's not all changed. We still have the iconic twin tailpipes surrounded by a pretty substantial carbon fiber diffuser. And then carbon ceramic brakes are as standard. We have this very heavily sculpted carbon sill down here, and the carbon fiber continues on the splitter around the front. And while we're around the front, the car is actually all about channeling air. It's not so much a downforce car as it does channel the majority of the air underneath the body of the car to generate most of its downforce, up to 95 kilograms, which is really more about high-speed stability than it is to do with keeping the car pinned in corners. And then overall, the side profile of it, just look how sleek it is. It's a very compact car, actually. It shares the same wheelbase as the Ferrari Portofino and also shares the same engine, albeit it's been specifically tuned for the characteristics of a GT. Now, Ferrari actually class this car as a front mid-engine car because they've managed to push the engine so far back in the chassis that half of it actually sits underneath the dashboard, and we'll share shortly how that translates to driving the dynamics out on the road. But as a result, it's allowed for such a compact Grand Tourer, which normally Ferrari Grand Tourers are pretty big. If you think all the way back to the likes of the 550, the F12, the 599, all of these cars have inherently been quite large. Now, if we think there's been some substantial tweaks and changes to the design on the outside, just wait until you see the inside. Also, check out these door handles. Look how deep they go in there. It's like you're pulling on a massive sill. It's huge. Now then, For me, as beautiful and new as the exterior is, the interior is a dramatic change. So basically all of this is filtered down from SF90. You've got two very distinct driver and passenger zones here. And what I love is subtle things like this switchgear here. While it is all electronic in this, it is a really nice nod to the design language of cars of the 50s and 60s. But I think we'll just hop in and show you just how much this car's changed. Okay, so here we are, behind the wheel of the new Ferrari Roma. Now, I can't tell you how much this has changed, particularly considering the majority of the experience in Ferraris just as old as a year ago were quite analog. Look at this massive screen. This is an entirely digital instrument cluster. There's no physical dials anymore. And a great deal of interaction on the wheel is done with touch screens. You'll notice here, there's no buttons. There's a suggestion of a button here and down here. This is all touchscreens. So in order to bring this on, that's a touch like that. It will light up. We have a very fancy animation on the screen, and then everything becomes apparent. This screen is huge. You've got everything from your sat nav in small screen on the left there, media, radio, revs in the middle, and then this is the menu that you interact with using this new little touch screen here. This is an up, down, left, right swipe screen, and it just swipes between all of the different menus. So as I'm swiping with my thumb here, it makes this kind of strange little swiping sound to reassure you that that input has been made. And then once you're in the menu you want to scroll through, you just up and down like so. Now the idea behind this, Ferrari says, is to make sure that the driver can maintain their hands on the wheel for as long as possible during the drive. So everything that you want to interact with on this screen here is accessible just with your thumb right here on this touch screen. Home from main menu, and that's to navigate sub menus. The interesting thing is, if you leave this for about 30 seconds, the wheel effectively goes into standby mode, so that when you're driving spiritedly, you don't accidentally press something to change your view of your screen. So you end up just pressing that and it reactivates the touch screen functions on the wheel. The other thing, which is iconic to a Ferrari wheel over the last 10 years, is of course the Manettino. Now that still stays here and it is still a nice analog switch. However, you'll notice that little logo on it there. That is Bumpy road mode. So that is no longer a separate button. It's on the switch here. You press that and the car enters Bumpy road mode. It's very nicely integrated, but in terms of a leap forward, in terms of aesthetics, driving experience, being in this thing feels like an entirely different brand. I mean, it's a massive step change. And it's not until you've got inside it and appreciated all of these upgrades that you realize why Ferrari believe that this car will appeal to 70% brand new clients, because all of a sudden it is bang up to date, and in fact in many areas exceeds a lot of the competition in this space. So while all of your driver zone is actuated up front here and on the wheel, you also have another portrait layout screen right here, which deals with things like sat nav, climate control, phone, audio, etc. So you can toggle between all of these things, phone, audio, and it will be integrated with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto as well, which is music to my ears. So you've got the best of both worlds here, and then of course there's a third screen over here for the passenger. So if he wants to take over control of the audio or just see how fast you're going, anything like that, all of this is available for the passenger to keep themselves entertained. Even subtle features like this. There is no conventional door handle. That button there by my thumb, you depress that, door opens. So there's no actual analog buttons or handles pretty much anywhere, only here and the indicators. And there are some scroll wheels here for windscreen wipers. So if I was to scroll this wheel, look up and down, that's how that works. We got up and down here for cruise control activation. But yeah, everything is sculpted, it's new, it's beautiful, and it's touchscreen. And I can't help but think, because the interface is entirely based on a screen, no doubt there will be some interesting software updates which Ferrari will be able to provide in future if they wish to augment or improve something as they go. So yes, very clean, very cool, but importantly, let's find out what all of this is like when you're actually behind the wheel driving it. So we've seen the way it looks, but how does it drive? For me, the primary part is, of course, the heart and soul of the car, the engine. Now, it's a familiar engine because it is effectively from the Ferrari Portofino. However, the engine has had a specific tune geared up for the characteristics of how a GT car should feel. So, it's running 620 horsepower and 561 pounds-feet of torque. Very respectable numbers. However, when you combine that with the relatively light weight of just over 1,500 kilograms, and a car of this class and category actually is a remarkable weight, what you get is phenomenal reaction. The acceleration, the linear pull, that torque as well. I think, you know, this car revs out to just over 7. And I think that seamlessly brings us on to the gearbox. So an entirely new 8-speed dual clutch transmission has been developed. Listen to the shift speed of that. Has been developed for this car. Get a load of the downshifts. listen how fast these upshifts are. Wow, and then under downshifts, it's absolutely instantaneous. It's almost telepathically connected to your brain. It just knows when you want that gear, and it's absolutely razor sharp. So this is in part to new gearbox hardware and new gearbox software. The gearbox as well also weighs 6 kilograms less than the outgoing 7-speed gearbox, despite the fact that this is now running 8 speeds, so an extra cog. It's a smaller, it's better packaged, but ultimately it's all about this. Yeah, it picks up and goes. And it sounds, despite the fact that fundamentally this is the same engine from the Portofino or the Lusso V8, it sounds dramatically different. It really does have its distinctive own tone. And the marriage, the relationship between this engine and the gearbox is sublime. Just more impressively for me than the upshifts is the downshifts under fairly heavy braking. Listen. I absolutely love that in a driver's car. It's so in tune. The gears are there absolutely when you want it. Now, the fundamental architecture of this engine has been winning awards for quite some time, and it's not actually until you experience it firsthand that you realise why, because turbocharged engines, there's always that inherent amount of lag. Granted, in this day and age, it's being dialed out more and more, but this car, despite the fact that it is heavily turbocharged, the throttle response is instantaneous. It drives a lot more like a naturally aspirated throttle, and yet it's underpinned by that fantastic amount of torque that you get from a turbocharged car. It's like the best of both worlds. Now, one compromise does come in the overall sound of the engine and exhaust, but as far as turbochargers go, it sounds pretty good. And don't forget that this is supposed to be a daily driver Grand Tourer that you can sort of switch off and relax in. So it's not overtly loud, but when you want it to be, it's plenty entertaining enough. Now, just quickly back to the gearbox. Not only has it been specifically built and developed for this car, but so have the gear ratios themselves. Now, the car only revs out to 7.5. However, the way you go through the box is actually quite quick. So from second here, you ready? Look at that. Like, you really fire through the gears. You know, yet the odd character trait is when you want to, you can put this thing into automatic like so, and it will work its way through these gears pretty quickly. And despite the fact that those ratios feel quite short, they're also quite well mapped to a Grand Tourer experience, which is quite unusual actually. Having said that, what there isn't from the gearbox is any sort of theatrics. What I mean by that is, what Ferrari have done in the past has engineered in a very, very fast throttle cut upon the upshift of the gearbox. But what that does is have the effect of really slamming that gear home. This doesn't have any of that. On the one hand, that's very impressive, just to see how seamless a twin clutch shift can be. On the other hand, it doesn't quite have the same amount of drama or interaction that you might expect if you've driven something like a 458 or a 488, which really slams that gear home. But that really is where the sort of GT credentials meet with the sports car side of things. Now, it's not an aggressive shift by any means. I think ultimately that suits the complete character of this car, but if you're looking for something with a bit more excitement upon the shift, this car might be lacking slightly in that department. Now then, this isn't really a word that you associate with the Roma or this sort of entry-level Grand Tourer, but downforce. Now, as we spoke about during the walk and talk of the exterior of this car, there is no flicks or wings or canards or anything to suggest that there is any priority being placed on downforce with this car, and that's because there isn't. There is only 95 kilograms available, and the majority of it takes place on the underbody of the car, and it's really there to keep the car stable at higher speeds. This isn't to keep it pinned around tight corners. It's just for those big GT constant crossing journeys where you want stability when you're destroying the auto routes. That being said, there is an active Aero rear wing. Now, this is something that actuates on its own. There's no button on the inside where you can extend the wing yourself. There are 3 modes. Default mode is effectively fully retracted, still following the beautiful contours of the rear of the car. Medium downforce is, as the name would suggest, basically halfway open, and then maximum downforce is full attack, and the car will decide what is optimum when and where you would need it. So you just let it get on and flap about on its own, actually. But I do like the fact that it tucks away and recesses back into the line of the car because it has a beautiful profile. Now, I think what we really need to be talking about is handling, because to my surprise, Ferraris of the last decade, pretty much starting from 458 Italia onwards, the steering feel, while very precise, has been very light, dare I say hollow at times. There's still feedback, there is feel, and you can lean on it, but it's always been very light, and I've always just hoped for there to be a little bit more meat to lean on. Well, you'll be happy to know that in the Roma, despite the fact that it's a Grand Tourer and its last word isn't lap times, the steering feels great. There's plenty to lean on. It's definitely heavier than the previous generation steering racks. I know I keep banging on about this gearbox, but I love a good gearbox. My favourite being a twin clutch, and it's connected to a Ferrari V8. So really, what's happening right here? Driving through Italy in the summer, surrounded by vineyards with a new twin clutch box. So as far as Mondays go, this is up there. All of the things that I've just spoken about, what it really adds up to, and this is the most important thing, is confidence. When you're in it, it feels a very friendly car, it's very progressive, all of that power, despite the fact that it has 620 horsepower, you can really use it. It never feels intimidating. The systems are very well calibrated. I think it's a great trick all round. And then what's it like to interact with this entirely new human interface? Well, I mean, I've been in a very fortunate position over the years that I've got to spend quite a lot of time in Ferraris, and when you become familiar with that system, I felt the previous setup was pretty simple. There weren't too many options, and they stuck with that layout for the last 10 years actually. And while that's been cool, yeah, you see, it's really easy once it does break loose. And while that's been cool, it was time for a change. I mean, really, you get into the 488 now, and even though it's had a sort of mild facelift, it is beginning to sort of show its age. You get in this, I mean, let's just sit back and look at this for a minute. It is, compared to the previous generation, spacecraft tech. Now, ultimately, all of this first debuted in the SF90, and it's made its way down to this car, and it has distinctly separate driver and passenger zones that really wrap around you. The massive screen in front of you feels fighter jet-esque. And once you've spent a few hours behind the wheel, these little touch screens, after a while, you kind of just clicks in with your brain, but you do have to think about it just a little bit. Now, the irony of this is that Ferrari have always been about emphasis on hands on the wheel, eyes on the road. And actually during the press briefing of this car, they actually reinforced that strapline a few times, even going to the extent of demonstrating that part of the development of the interface of this car and SF90 was to do eye tracking tech and trials and tests to see where people spend the most time looking when they're not looking at the road. And they keep banging on about it's really important to keep your hands on the wheel at all times, and that's why we've developed this system so you can do as many things as possible without taking your hands off the wheel and maintaining eye contact with the road. Ironically, they still feel the need to mount the shift paddles on the steering column and not the steering wheel, meaning when you're slightly crossed up or coming out of a tight corner, you have to take your hand off the wheel to shift up a gear or down a gear. Now maybe in a Grand Tourer like this you could probably get away with it, but every now and again I've been on some tight switchbacks here and you're coming out of these second gear hairpins and the lock's on and you just have to take your hand off the wheel to pull that paddle. I'd be interested to hear from you in the comments below, pedals on the steering wheel or pedals on the steering column. It's a long debate, guys. So, to summarise, really, it is a disservice to call it a Portofino with a hardtop. Despite the fact that it shares the same wheelbase and engine, the characteristics of it, the sound, the handling, massively the interior. I mean, even if it was a Portofino, you get inside and all of that goes out of the window, sir. But that's not it. The way it drives fundamentally feels different. It still has that more sporty edge. But look, it's all well and good me being up here in perfect driving conditions on amazing roads in Italy. You know, you can get a bit jaded with situations like this and think, oh, this is the best thing in the world. What I'm hoping for from this car is that it really does become the Ferrari that people drive daily. I think we'll all acknowledge that Ferrari as a brand has very mileage sensitive clients and cars, and the reason is because no one actually drives them. It's this sort of self-perpetuating downward cycle where everyone's a bit afraid to put mileage on, but if we all go out and put mileage on, everyone's cool. So I'm hoping with this, people will live with these things, and I think that's ultimately, as I mentioned, great being on these fantastic driving roads, but more importantly, I think for the brand and the car is that the proposition of this is to just get out there, use it, put on the miles, and just go and enjoy it. That's what I'm hoping for from this car, and importantly, it feels like a car you could really do that with. You could easily live with this thing every single day. It's an effortless Grand Tourer, and the packaging of the car, it's not overly big. So once you are on that Grand Tour and you end up in a tight city centre, like I am right now, no problem at all. So all in all, it's quite a compelling package. I'm trying to think what I don't like about it. Well, this isn't something that I dislike, but it's not necessarily the last word in excitement. I know that sounds absolutely absurd, being sat in the seat of a brand new Ferrari, but it's not the sort of thing that sets you alight. It's just a very, very good car. And so there you have it. First drive, really. First drive in the new Ferrari Roma. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave your questions and comments below, and I look forward to seeing you next time.